Good evening. I'm Alessandro Barchiesi, Professor of Classics here at NYU, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Ranieri Colloquium, which is sponsored by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies. The director of the center, my friend and colleague, Matthew Santirocco, who very much wanted to be here to welcome you, is recovering, unfortunately, from a nasty back injury. So he asked me to welcome you in his place. The focus of this conference, which will take place this evening and tomorrow afternoon, is on creative appropriations of Ovid's Metamorphoses in translation, literature, dance, the visual arts, and film, and their relationship to the study of Ovid. A secondary focus, but not so secondary, is more local, because many of the presentations will explore ways in which metamorphoses have been appropriated by artists who are operating in New York City, are creating works that are set in New York City. I would like to thank the center's benefactor, Mr. Sel Ranieri, who has endowed this annual conference. His vision and generosity continue to make possible the work of the center. I would like also to thank the NYU units that are co-sponsoring, the Department of Classics, the NYU Gray Art Museum, and the NYU Center for Ballet and the Arts. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence, I guess tomorrow, of the artist Wally Reinhardt, one of whose paintings is illustrating a scene from Metamorphoses on the cover of the conference program, and whose work will be discussed in more detail tomorrow. And finally, I would like to thank Matthew Santirocco, the director of the center, for his enthusiastic support of the project, his help in organizing. And I'd like to thank Anna Donch, the program administrator of the center, for all her efforts to make this a successful evening. If you would like to learn more about the activities of the NYU Center for Ancient Studies, please pick up a copy of the center's fall newsletter at the registration table. And there are also cards that you can fill out if you wish to be added to the center's mailing list. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this evening keynote session, Professor Alessandro Schiesaro. It can be a bit tricky, but basically I go Alessandro, and he can be addressed as Ale if you want to separate the names. Alessandro is quite busy these days because he's the 24th director of the Scuola Normale di Pisa. But he's here as his usual self, a leading Latinist who has published on authors such as Lucretius, Virgil, Horace, Seneca, and Ovid. He's also working on a project on Ovid's Metamorphoses. And initially, I was tempted to say that the New York connection is maybe not so strong, but he's well known as one of the very few classicists who know how to do things with psychoanalysis. That was never a very successful instrument in classics, but I don't need this kind of connection because his title, which is not on the program, which is extremely attractive, is Searching for Galatea, a short tour of Ovid's New York. Alessandro.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandro, and thank you to all the friends at NYU who have made this possible. It's a great pleasure, it's an honor, but I will say more about pleasures, honors, and celebrations at the end of my presentation. First, I would like to suggest that we take a short tour between uptown and downtown, mostly through images, but also through words. Following in the footsteps of a tour I actually have taken myself last year, as it happens, partly on foot and partly on books, in this metamorphic city, a city that, by definition, like Ovid, never ceases to surprise and indeed to amaze. It is also a city built on metamorphic rock, which maybe has something to do with our topic, but I will remain firmly above ground, so no worries about that. So my tour was prompted by an interest, which is part of the project that Alessandro Barchiesi just mentioned, on the many stories of petrification in the Metamorphoses. They're quite numerous, actually, when you start looking for them. But their collective importance is overshadowed by the opposite story, very famous instance of reverse process, that is the animation of Galatea's statue. For all that it is actually made of ivory and not of stones, and of course she was not called Galatea to begin with in Ovid, but that's another story. So one of the questions I asked myself is what would happen if we insert the story of Pygmalion and Galatea, and we have to keep calling her Galatea because otherwise it would become too complicated, into a broader discussion, the broader context of the poem's dynamic approach to the relationship between the human and the mineral world that Ovid delineates in his poem. So seeing it part of a more sort of a wider process rather than an isolated instance. And a focus on petrification and its reversal confirms that the boundaries of these two worlds, the human and the mineral, are actually as fluid as all the boundaries are in the Metamorphoses, and also suggests different ways in which we can read some key features, not just of this episode, it seems to me, but also of its implication, its wider implication for the poem. You will all understand my enthusiasm, therefore, when Jhumpa Lahiri mentioned last year that, when we met last year, that she was writing bone into stone, but I will come back to it in a moment. So much as they can be seen, and in fact I think they should be seen as two facets of the same process, a very radical difference sets the episode of Pygmalion and Galatea apart from the episodes where petrification occurs. The episode has long been regarded as key to understanding the poetics of Metamorphoses, and Ovid's view of the artist of the male artist as a powerful demiurge, as the gendered embodiment of the triumph of logos over inert matter, triumph of art and the triumph of love, as it has been dubbed. Stories of petrification do much to complicate this picture, this very linear picture, indeed to spoil, as it were, fortunately it seems to me, this picture. Matter may not be inert to begin with, and the wonders that Pygmalion achieves as a sculptor paved the way, in fact, for the disastrous deeds of his progeny, which is beset by incest and death. But I promised the tour in images, and so I need to stop with this kind of very, very brief outline. And here I think is where my quest chimes with the subtitle of today's event, Creative Appropriations and the Study of Ovid, the emphasis being, of course, on the "and" in the middle of the sentence. A lot of us long taken for granted, and indeed they've taken for granted in large measure, as I will say in a moment, thanks to the work of Alessandro Barchiesi, that the creative reception of a text is crucial to our understanding of its meaning or its meanings, or to borrow a very famous statement from David Lodge, that Shakespeare's influence on Chaucer is as interesting as Chaucer's influence on Shakespeare. This is true of text in general, the Metamorphoses in general, but it seems to me of Pygmalion and Galatea very specifically. And among these appropriations, it seems to me that the ones in the figurative arts stand out as particularly influential. I'll try to give you some examples in a moment. But first I want to go back to another case in point, a stunning case in point, in 2012, when the National Gallery in London organized an exhibition of two large canvases by Titian, Diana and Actaeon and Diana and Callisto, which had been recently purchased by the gallery, and could therefore be shown side by side with the incomplete Death of Actaeon, the first time since the 18th century that the triptych was reassembled as the artist has conceived it for the Spanish King Philip II. So to mark the reunion of this painting, the National Gallery invited 3 very prominent artists, visual artists, Chris O'Feely, Conrad Shawcroft, and Mark Wallinger, to create a work of art as well as ballet, inspired by and conversing with Titian, Ovid, and Titian's reading of Ovid. And several leading poets were also invited to compose on the same subject. 2 of the 3 artworks on display focus on Actaeon, a character whose paradigmatic importance is comparable to Pygmalion's, stands out as important as that. He's a symbol of troubled knowledge. It was for Giordano Bruno, it was for Jacques Lacan. But he's also the protagonist of 2014 film Metamorphoses by Christophe Honoré, which embraces the story as a reflection on the drives and dangers of art by placing the episode into the narrative as a general proem to the film and embodying metamorphosis in a transgender Diana. In Wallinger's Diana, a dark room houses a wooden structure featuring 4 round small windows, a wooden Venetian blind, and a keyhole that allow the viewer to peer inside. So you enter this dark room, and then you see this wooden structure and a keyhole, where an actress is taking a bath or doing her makeup in a mirror. As well as producing in a physical form, it seems to me, a defining structural strategy of the metamorphosis, the embeddedness of stories within stories. You enter into a dark, you're in a room, you enter a dark room, and for the dark room, there is actually a wooden structure within it. Wallinger replicates Pygmalion's transformations of an inanimate object into a living being. And as he does so, he forces a reflection on the central aspect of Actaeon's story in Ovid, in its Ovidian form, the unwitting but guilty gaze of the young hunter and the involvement of readers and spectators in his error, in his mistake, and their conniving in his voyeurism. Now, if visual representation of Pygmalion always engaged the spectator in the reenactment of the myth, Wallinger's real-life Diana's Galatea, as it were, squared this reenactment with power, exasperating the objectification of the female character and the scopophilic drive of the viewer. Once inside the dark room, spectators initially share Actaeon's surprise reactions. They don't know what to expect. They don't know there is this box inside, because nothing had hinted at what is held within it. But after the first look, after they realize what's going on, they must decide whether to keep on looking or not. And if they do, as most did, they become complicit in this act. And retrospectively, even that first ostensibly innocent gaze, we come to realize results, after all, from curiosity and desire, not just from the unpredictability of roaming in a forest one doesn't know well. And to conclude with Titian and with London, Shawcroft's installation Trophy is another very interesting case in point. Here, Shawcroft reduces Ovid's and Titian's story to a disembodied fetishist metonymy, an Actaeon who's already metamorphosed into a stag and in fact is already dead. All we see of the stag is part of his antlers sculpted in wood. This trophy is already in Titian, actually, where the skull of a stag in the background, placed on a stone pillar, foreshadows the tragic outcome of the story. All the events that have led to these fateful conclusions are condensed and indeed petrifying, we might well say, in this inert materiality of the sculpture, although this is wood rather than rock. Movement remains the exclusive property of a machine. That metal arm actually moves and sort of controls and almost tortures the antlers. An industrial robot that sometimes falls onto itself, like Diana actually making herself up on the mirror, and then points this arm to the remnants of the man. The more involved I became with Pygmalion and Galatea, the more I was struck by how influential the artistic representations of the episode proved in implicitly shaping our reading of Ovid, as they draw attention to aspects of the narrative whose implications are elusive, whether they collaborate in occluding certain aspects of the episode, or on the contrary, they bring to the fore what the text prefers to blur and obscure. So we start with two very different paintings, both equally misleading, if for very different reasons. Agnolo Sbronzino's, yes, Pygmalion and Galatea, painted in Florence in around 1530, is the first representation of this myth as a self-standing work of art rather than the illustration for an additional Ovid. And it is the only one featuring this scene to precede the 18th century, when the subject becomes widely popular, in fact, wildly popular, and sculptures and paintings multiply. The prominent female figure to the left stands on a pedestal. There is a lot to be said about how it's described, but I won't do it. And her incipient movements are limited, as you can see, to the space that is delimited by the pedestal on which she stands. She must be Galatea, we assume, emerging from her inanimate status, yet her posture is essentially that of a Venus Pudica. Also, Pygmalion kneeling in front of her suggests not so much his interaction with the woman after the miracle has occurred, as his prayer to the goddess. So much so that writing around 50 years after the painting was completed, a near-contemporary critic, Giorgio Vasari, identified the subject as Pygmalion praying to Venus. Bronzino's work partakes of the same self-reflexive features of Ovid's story. It also shows, through the interweaving of sensuality and restraint, and the suggestion of a three-way relationship between Galatea, Venus, and Venus Pudica, and Venus, the goddess of love, a very sharp, a very keen awareness of the sexual tensions which characterized his literary model. Bronzino is responsible for promoting a momentous and enduring misunderstanding of Ovid's narrative, where there is no mention of Galatea in a standing position. The sculptor is described by Ovid as utterly besotted, but he never worships Galatea from a distance. Ovid, on the contrary, zooms in on his frenzied touching, both of the statue and then of the woman, and the final frame of the episode, for all its kind of coy conciseness, with lots of omissions there, make it clear that the two have sex after Pygmalion places her in a bed. A scene which is actually described in several book illustrations before Bronzino. Book illustrations, of course, have the great advantage that can be like cartoon strips. You can have more moments of the stories described, whereas a statue or a painting necessarily has to focus on one climactic moment. These kind of distortions and omissions paved the way for the staging of Galatea's vivification in a wondrous atmosphere. I will not show you many paintings, but some of them are, I think, part of the collective conscious in this case. A wondrous atmosphere that justifies the passive attitude of most modern Pygmalions, astounding at the miracle unfolding before their eyes. Far from lying in bed with Galatea, they keep a respectful distance, often kneeling in a pose that variously conveys amazement or ecstasy or prayer, but bypasses his courting of the statue and the erotic climax of Ovid's story. This erasure of the sexual dimension of the episode obscures the more perturbing connotation of Pygmalion, his aggressiveness, the fetishist and even incestuous undertones of his act of creation, thus making space for the prevailing interpretation of the sculptor as an innocent artist whose pious intentions and behaviors are justly rewarded by Venus. A visit to the Met shows where further developments of this strategy can lead. Pygmalion and Galatea by Jean-Louis Léon Gérôme, 1890, which inevitably represents, it's not Chrysophilia, by the way, that is just a misprint. Chrysophilia will come later, but I think it would be very offended if I thought that that's by him. You will get Chrysophilia in just a moment. I'm about to finish. Like this very famous painting by Gérôme, who was completely obsessed with the topic, painted and sculpted it several times, which inevitably represents Galatea as a standing statue, but stages a fantasy of reciprocity that is completely absent in Ovid. This is clearly Galatea embracing Pygmalion as he embraces her. In Ovid, she's completely passive, voiceless, and motionless. while she lies in bed under Pygmalion. Downtown, we get a very different story. Wally Reinhardt's arresting gouache, I should say that I did not know that Wally Reinhardt would be here and it would be discussed, because I got actually the final program very late in the day. Wally Reinhardt's arresting gouache captures both for what I, for one, regard as the core of Ovid's narrative, desire and lust, and its troubling implications. And for this very reason, because he captures it so well, I can only display a very small section of his work, because the rest is really a bit forthright. And so I omit the part where Pygmalion's sexual excitement is very explicit. In fact, I don't know whether intentionally or not, but it harks back to a tradition of Pygmalion as a sort of almost semi-pornographic subject in 18th century illustrations by Thomas Rollinson and various other people, not many of them. But if you look at the contrast between the muscular, the lively toned body of the man and Galatea's outline, you get a sense, a evanescent outline, you get a sense of how deep this reading of the episode is. One is tempted to think that the Galatea is not a body at all, but the mere shadow of a body. Its uniformly pale grey complexion, rather reminiscent of a dream or even of death. That's, of course, Galatea lying on his shoulders. The catalogue of the 2019 exhibition here at the Grey Museum describes Galatea as a Matisse-like drawing of a sleeping odalisque, and I think it's fair enough as far as Matisse is concerned, but to me the contrast between the two characters, the way they are portrayed, conveys also a very troubling difference in age between the two, which again is one of the less obvious, but it seems to me very perceptible undercurrents coursing through Ovid's lines. Although radically different, Reinhardt's reading of Pygmalion chimes with Chrysophil's interpretation of Actaeon in the series of accounts that he produced for the Titian exhibition in 2012. As he suggested, Actaeon is neither innocent nor unlucky, but driven by a desire and lust. Ovid taps into a subdued aspect of Ovid's characterization and of his narrative technique. Again, in a way, it's a parallel operation to Wallinger, because Ovid, as we know, not infrequently endows a character with positive features at odds with its much more checkered past in previous texts. But we are meant, in a way, to remember that this past is there. And according to multiple ancient sources, for instance, Actaeon is a guilty voyeur or even a rapist, whom the Metamorphoses portray as a blameless victim of chance. And Pygmalion has a much more limited pedigree, as it were. The sources are, few and far between. In fact, there's only one, to be honest. But again, his pre-Ovidian past is far from reassuring. But what Ovid represses, Ophelia, like Reinhardt, retrieves for us to see. And finally, leaving images aside for a moment, I would like to point out, as I conclude, how brilliantly the fetishist and irrational aspects of Ovid's Pygmalion are captured in Alice Shakar's Million Years From Now. His Pygmalion is a down-at-heeled compulsive hoarder living at the margin of a dystopic NYC circa 1 BC, a pathetic artist working with bottle cups and bits of colored glass and obsessed by the Byzantine mysteries of Galatea's dreams. We are as far away as possible from the myth of the artist that Pygmalion has regularly been seen to embody, but much more closer, because of that, to the heart of what I believe, the heart of Ovid's poem. I hope I've given you a very rapid sketch of how felicitous the title of today's event really is. The creative appropriation of the Metamorphoses is testimony to the fascination that the Ovid stories exert on artists of all ages and affiliations, as well as an irreplaceable part it plays in our study of it. We're gathered here to celebrate the continuing vitality of this poem and much else. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a celebration of NYU as a welcoming and thriving intellectual community, and I'm delighted to see some very old friends and to listen to new ones over the next today and tomorrow. It is also crucially the celebration of 2 books and 2 authors. To those of you who have not yet had the pleasure of reading Jhumpa Lahiri's Bone into Stone, I can only recommend that you do it forthwith. because the weaving of deep learning, personal experience, and visionary insights it manages to pack into its pages is a wonder to behold. If stones have a life, as surely they do, then Jhumpa is clearly their bard. The other book is not as slim, but no less learned and elegant. Alessandro Barchiesi conceived the idea of a new, multi-author commentary on the Metamorphoses over 3 decades ago. When it first came out in Italian between 2005 and 2014, it made waves in Europe and beyond, and affirmed a widespread intimation that we're truly witnessing the flowering of a new Ovidian age. Arguably the most influential architect of that age, Sandro, as editor-in-chief and commentator of the first 3 books, shaped the endeavor in such a way as to enable a conversation like the one we're having today. A commentary more interested in raising interesting questions, intriguing questions, and opening up unexpected vistas than handing down narrowly defined answers. Its pages full of surprises and indeed of parallels with performance, spectacle, and the visual arts. The revised edition came out in English in 2024 and confirmed the status of the commentary as the defining guide to Ovid's poem. For understandable editorial reasons, it omits Sandro's magnificent introduction, which, among other gems, contains a section on art and spectacle in the epic landscape. I personally think that he should publish the introduction as a separate book, as a monograph on the Metamorphoses, but more of this can be discussed later. It is very exciting to see that the commentary is now out in paperback, since this will make it much more widely available in the classrooms and among the general public, because it's a commentary that actually can be read on 2 levels. It's rewarding both for those who study Latin as a mission or as a profession, but is also completely understandable to the lay readers who really wants to be guided through the intricacies of this fantastic poem. And by the way, I should mention that it is possible to order the paperback edition with a conference discount by filling out one of the slips at the registration counter, which, and there are also some copies if you want to look at them. So I conclude my preliminary remarks, and it is a great pleasure now to invite Alessandro Barchiesi, Professor of Classics at NYU, to take the stand.
Thank you very much. I'm going to tell you 3 stories, very briefly, 3 examples about Ovid's Metamorphoses being appropriated, but also contested. It is also about how controversial the text can be. And this is all about Daphne. My part 1 is about Iris van Herpen. Her work in fashion is connected to New York because a couple of her, some of her works are actually in museums in New York. And recently she was asked to produce the fashion for the very important New York event, the New York City Ballet Fashion Gala. Now, in 2020, I had this email by an unexpected reader of Ovidian scholarship, the famous fashion designer Iris van Herpen. She mentioned that she was planning a whole new haute couture collection inspired by Metamorphoses entitled Metamorphism, and she wanted me to expand on a sentence I had written about a contemporary reception of the poem, which I quote, "In the case of our era, the context most likely to explain the unexpected return of fortune of Metamorphoses have to do with the new relationship between nature and artifice, a great Ovidian theme, and with ideas of correcting physicality and consciousness." I guess I had just been reading Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections here. So plastic surgery, genetic engineering, cloning, psychopharmaceuticals, virtual worlds, modification of digital images, cyborgs, or sciences such as bioethics, ecology, artificial intelligence. Ovid's poem I was writing is becoming relevant again, no less than it was in the Rome of the first modern age, with its rediscovery of marble bodies from the classical past. So this was my old spiel, and Iris van Herpen immediately wrote a continuation to this, and I was not expecting that from fashion. And so I will give you just a couple of minutes just to make you enter her magical world. I always hope to do a paper in classics with a clip. The statue at the center is Daphne. Okay, enough. Oh, I cannot go back, so it's really, it is magic. Thank you so much. Back to the slides. We interrupt the magic, okay. Yes, thank you. So Van Herpen is no stranger to metamorphosis. The pun in the title of the collection, Metamorphosis, not Metamorphosis, hints that the metaverse and artificial intelligence are now encountering primordial myths of metamorphosis, and that Ovid can be the catalyst for this encounter. One of her most recent collections, Sensory Seas, operates in one of the favorite Ovidian settings, aquatic, with the help of professional deep divers. Now, is Iris van Herpen the new Ovid for the 21st century? I could try to prove that. Let me try to prove my claim. Like Ovid, Van Herpen focuses on metamorphosis as a transitory, transient hybrid state, spectacular in its transient appearance. She blends science and imagination, and this is something that the Middle Ages found out about Ovid. She is funny and witty. She explores the boundaries of the body. She enhances the sensuous potential of materials. That too is very Ovidian. Sand, feathers, leather, leaf, scale, silk, even seaweed, and so on. She is a virtuosa who draws attention, just like Ovid's Arachne and Arachne's Ovid, to the creation process itself, not just the final product. She deals with transformations of humans into natural creatures, animal, plant, mineral, that are also transformations of human into prosthetic or artificial. So Ovid's attention for humans with a grafted ivory shoulder or makeshift wings. Yet one question lingers. The power of Van Herpen's creations is that what we see is powerful women dynamically moving between nature and the metaverse, not objectified, not passive, not victims of metamorphosis. This reminds us of a question that is still urgent in our approaches to the ancient poem. The question is particularly appropriate since Van Herpen's starting point seems to have been Daphne. That was the topic of our first email exchange, and Daphne is the centerpiece, as you saw, of the fashion show, thanks to the sculpture. So Van Herpen's Daphne is freed from Apollo's persecution, as hinted ironically by the many tiny golden apolline drops shimmering around her dress. It would be difficult to claim the same for Bernini, for example. So how difficult is it to imagine a sustainable Ovid, to cultivate images of metamorphosis where sexual violence is not there? The question runs right through our contemporary global culture and is far from settled. Two examples follow. But first, remember that our Ovid is filtered by Renaissance art, or better, by a certain kind of Renaissance art. So Bernini, of course. Tommaso Montanari has built a case about Bernini as the artist fighting for freedom against the pressure of the Vatican, La Libertà di Bernini. And he quotes Ovid about the hair of Daphne, positos sine lege capillos. But what about Daphne herself and her own voice? This is not certainly empowering for Daphne. So translators are important. Translators are important because they inhabit a text. They find a house in a text, and we are lucky tonight to have Jhumpa Lahiri, who's been spending a lot of time with Ovid's Metamorphoses. Of course, with the additional bonus, we shall see that she's also a leading author of fiction. So what happens when this person enters the world of Ovid? But for now, the work of Stephanie McCarter, perhaps the first translation of Metamorphoses in English by a woman, I quote from a review by Richard Tarrant. Another priority for McCarter was to clearly and responsibly translate Ovid's scenes of sexual violence and rape. And here too, she's been largely successful, avoiding euphemism, but also refraining from sexualized, aesthetically loaded descriptions of female bodies when they are not in the Latin. And she quotes examples of previous translations that are doing just that. Now, her description of the role of such stories, argues Richard Tarrant, is among the best I have seen. The inclusion, and this is McCarter, the inclusion of so many stories of rape in the epic suggests, in fact, that Ovid felt such violence was worthy of critical interrogation, just as he shines a light on the negative repercussions of masculine heroics or divine power, precisely in order to question, not to celebrate them. So that is indeed an interesting argument. Although, remember, it has become difficult for us to look at Ovid without looking at Renaissance art. This is Titian again. Because my problem here is about the aestheticization of violence. And this is something that we as teachers and professors, we encounter that very frequently. It is not so much that Ovid cannot criticize violence, but the entire culture of imperial Rome is very much obsessed with the aestheticization of everything that is being put on display. So there is a moral problem here. The alternative must remain open. It requires an act of critical responsibility by teachers and scholars and translators, and easy irony on politically correct wokeness and cancel culture will not be enough, I'm afraid. But in my part two, I want to show you how one of the makers of contemporary cultures of research was actually obsessed with this problem, with the problem of Daphne and violence. So this is Daphne's Warburg. What happens if we shift back 1 century from the triumph of Van Herpen's creations back into the formative time of European modernity, the 1920s? Let me interrogate the work of someone who did so much, perhaps more than most, to invent the activity of which we are undeniably a part, transcultural reception studies. It turns out that Aby Warburg's great project, Mnemosine, his visual library and wonder wall of the transformations of antiquity, in fact has a lot to do with Ovid and with sexual violence in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Like Van Herpen, but in a very different context, Warburg approaches Ovid through a particular myth, Daphne and Apollo again. This became for him the cipher for the return of ancient art, but also for the primitive within ancient art, which was the other side of Warburg's idea. So this is something of the construction of what remains of Mnemosine, which is structurally oddly reminiscent of the early days of Facebook, the wall of Facebook. The construction has a crucial space for Daphne, Verfolgung und Verwandlung. So those are some of the panels, and Botticelli's Primavera is also crucial to that. Now, in 1926, after his painful recovery from mental health treatment in the sanatorium at Kreuzingen, Warburg is back and confident about his visionary project, the Atlas of Images, Mnemosyne. At this point in his career, he reveals that Ovid's Metamorphoses has been a constant inspiration for him. This happens when he offers an introduction to a guest talk on Ovid's Metamorphoses, of which scattered notes survive. It was by a professor at the Humboldt in Berlin, Karl Reinhardt. Now, Warburg is, of course, also very famous for his adventure in New Mexico, because the encounter with the plumed serpent was a defining moment in his vocation. Now, we realize that in Warburg, the other fundamental experience, the trip to the American Southwest, has somehow blended with the impact of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The context is clearer if we revisit Warburg's experience. Long before ending up at Kreuzingen, the Hopi snake dance, the Kashina dance, the cosmology, and the ritual, demonic energy, metamorphosis as internal process, dynamics of appropriation, emotional expression, pathos formel, as metamorphosis, dances of sexual pursuit, as impulses between modern art and its transformation. This actually means that Warburg's ideas were now shaped by anthropology, not just by art history, but they were also influenced by classical studies. The Hopi dance for him was filtered through Friedrich Nietzsche's idea. So it was the Hopi plus Nietzsche. The first account of a dance, which is, by the way, by a US cavalry officer 20 years before Warburg, is actually quite different. And it doesn't emphasize the demonic, Bacchic, Dionysiac element in the Hopi dance. So when Michael Friedberg went to the Warburg Institute as a student, he did have a project on illustrations of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Apparently nobody at the Institute at the time told him that the first research by Warburg had been on Ovid as a source of Botticelli, long before the Hopi experience. So Friedberg found out later for himself. Now, throughout his career, Warburg was haunted by ancient images of persecution and abduction. In 1888, as a graduate student, he goes to Florence, makes the discovery, which is his first research experience, first thrill of discovery. He found out that the image of Flora in Botticelli's Primavera is inhabited by the episode of sexual violence of Zephyr and Flora in Ovid's Fasti. So that's how Warburg begins his idea of the return of something through classical art and then through the Renaissance. So as we contemplate the future in Van Herpen's creation, it is also important to remember where we come from. And that leads me to my final example, which is contemporary and futuristic. The Vegetarian by Han Kang, Nobel Prize for Literature in 2024. I am grateful to our graduate student, Emma Mendes Correa, who recommended to me to look at this work. I'm not going to preempt her work on this, but I need a couple of observations because this is actually a new stage in the encounter of creative art and Ovid. The Vegetarian by Han Kang, 2007, is a novel about a woman named Yong Hai, I apologize for my Korean pronunciation, whose decision to become a vegetarian after disturbing dreams leads to devastating consequences. The story follows the fallout of this choice, which is seen as a bizarre and defiant act in her culture, in Korean culture, resulting in increasing conflict with her husband and family, her eventual institutionalization, her desire to shed her humanity altogether, becoming a plant, that is. So I only have 2 points to make. The first is quite simple. Some people already have mentioned Daphne in connection to this plot, but it's also relevant that the title is The Vegetarian, because Ovid's work is the place to go in antiquity if you want to hear about vegetarianism. And this is why the cover of our third volume in our commentary, which was chosen by Philip Hardy, is actually Rubens, Pythagoras preaching vegetarianism. So this is simply my first point. It is also true that Han Kang has been a student in a program of modern literature in a famous university in Seoul, and she was running a library, a bookshop, before the Nobel. My other point has to do with a striking moment right at the end of the novel, and allow me to quote. This is what the trees are doing by the end of the story. And this is the sister of the protagonist. She's now looking at nature with a different perspective. So I quote, "Quietly she breathes in, the trees by the side of the road are blazing, green fire undulating like the rippling flanks of a massive animal, wild and savage. In eye stars fiercely at the trees, as if waiting for an answer, as if protesting against something. The look in her eyes is dark and insistent." I'm sorry that I don't know the language. She publishes in Korean, as far as I can understand her project. This is about the reconstruction of a whole national literature with the inspiration of antagonism, resistance, and deviance, so a whole new Korean literature. But my point is what happens a few pages before the ending. And that's my second quote. This is her sister visiting her in the psychiatric hospital. When she came at the unexpected sight of a female patient doing headstands at the far end of the western corridor, it never even crossed her mind that it might be Young Hai. Her sister was upside down and balancing on her hands, her face flushed, almost puce. And so this is the explanation. This is the truth about trees that the protagonist has found in the extreme suffering of her illness. And she says, I thought trees stood up straight. I only found out just now they actually stand with both arms in the earth, all of them. Look over there, aren't you surprised? Young-hae sprang up and pointed to the window. All of them, they're all standing on their heads. Do you know how I found out? Well, I was in a dream and I was standing on my head. Leaves were growing from my body and rocks were sprouting from my hands. So I dug down into the earth on and on. So there are important psychiatric aspects to this. But what if we look back at the entire tradition about Daphne? Because the entire tradition, literary visual about Daphne, and this is Pollaiolo, is that the pathos the formula is like this. So Daphne is not only standing up, she is with the arms, the branches, standing up. And Latin is a language where brachia and arms of trees, twigs are interchangeable. So my point, and this is really the end, is that Han Kang is actually turning the whole tradition upside down. She doesn't care for us to recognize this as classicism. She is not inviting the audience to participate into a community based on ancient text and mythology, because that has been done a lot in the past. But she is turning that tradition upside down. And I can actually prove somehow with the old instruments of philology, I could actually prove that she knows this connection, because this is one of her very early works, with a provocative title, The Fruit of My Woman, a short story that came up long ago in the magazine Granta in 1997. Now, this is far less effective than The Vegetarian, the works that earned her the Nobel Prize, simply because this is a story on metamorphosis, where the metamorphosis actually happens on the physical level. So I quote, "This is visualized and focused by the husband of this wife. I ran to the sink, turned the tap on all the way, filled the plastic wash bowl until it overflowed. The water slapped at the sides with each of my hasty footsteps, sloshing onto the living room floor as I hurried back to the balcony. As soon as I splashed it onto my wife's chest, her entire body underwent a quivering revival like the leaf of a huge plant. I went back and refilled the wash bowl, returning to pour it over my wife's head. Her hair sprang up, as though some invisible weight had been compressing it. I watched her glittering green body bloom afresh with my baptism. I felt dizzy. My wife had never been so beautiful." So I think you would all agree that this is a first step, maybe a necessary step towards something which is far better, which is not simply imitation of Ovid. It is contestation of Ovid. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Barchiesi. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jhumpa Lahiri, bilingual writer and translator. She is the Millicent C. McIntosh Professor of English, as well as the Director of Creative Writing at Barnard College at Columbia University. She divides her time between New York and Rome, and the writing between English and Italian. Her debut collection of stories, Interpreter of Maladies, received the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Her novel, The Namesake, a New York Times Notable Books and Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist, was adapted into the motion picture directed by Mira Nair. Her other books include, I don't want to list them all, An Accustomed Earth, which won the Frank O'Connor Prize, The Lowland, finalist of both the Booker Prize and National Book Award, and Translating Myself and Others, finalist of the Penn Diamondstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. In Italian, she is the author of In Altre Parole, which is translated as in other words, Il Vestito dei Libri, The Clothing of Books, and Dove mi trovo, which was since translated as Whereabouts, and several other books in Italian, written directly in Italian. She received the National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama in 2014, and in 2019, she was named Commander of the Italian Order of Merit by the President of the Republic of Italy. She was inducted as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2024. She's been attending now for a few years to the translation of the Metamorphoses of Ovid, together with Professor Yelena Baraz of Princeton University. And it is indeed on translating the Metamorphoses that Jhumpa Lahiri will now talk. Thank you so much.
Oops, okay. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you to NYU and to everybody who made this possible. I am really happy to be here at this moment of the long journey of trying to bring Ovid into English again, because it's certainly not the first time. And I'd like to basically talk to you tonight about the origins of this project and a bit about the process and where we are at the moment. Professor Yelena Baraz and I are collaborators on this project. Well, the first thing I'll say is the idea of celebrating the metamorphoses in New York is very relevant because I discovered Ovid in New York City as a student at Barnard College, which I attended many, many years ago. I was an English major, but I became increasingly attracted to the ancient world, ancient literature, Latin, ancient Greek, partly because I was really focusing on medieval and Renaissance literature in English. So, Shakespeare, Chaucer, Spencer, these were my authors. And I knew from the very fine education I received at Barnard that, these authors were deeply indebted to Ovid. But in fact, so I was curious about him, but in fact, I wanted to share with you so Ovid is so interested in the question of origin, right? So I really want to trace the very first encounter I had with Ovid in my whole life. I was a huge fan of, reader of various versions of Greek and Roman myths written for children throughout my life, but I hadn't really reckoned with Ovid as an author until I got to college, and I took a course, actually it was a course called Modern Literature. And in this course called Modern Literature, we read, among other authors, James Joyce, and we read Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. And so those of you who know this novel, which went on to become such an important novel for me personally, it begins with this citation of Ovid. And I still have the copy, the paperback, that I bought as a college student in 1985, my first year of Barnard. And so the professor was giving the lecture, and he must have written the translation of the Latin, which you see here in bold, et ignotas animum dimittit in artes. And I think I was sitting at the back, and because I had really no connection to Latin at all, I'd studied some French in high school, so I wrote down in my book this translation that was wrong. I wrote, and he sets his mind to work upon unknown acts. I must have read the R as a C, not even thinking to look at the word artes in Latin and realizing there was obviously a connection to the word art in English. Anyway, I must have figured out that this was actually referring to the word art and not act. So in my book, I replicated what I have in my copy. So I have this written out by hand, and kind of my handwriting has changed over the decades, but I had this much more slanted handwriting. I would have brought the book, but it's in my house in Rome, so I would have brought you a screenshot of this. But I crossed out acts and I put in arts. So that's my very first translation of Ovid, so realizing this error. And this is very relevant because Ovid is so interested in this question of error and wandering and mistake-making, right? And this interesting ambiguity we have in that word. Anyway, because of this epigraph in Joyce's novel, that is what led me, in addition to my interest in Shakespeare, Chaucer, etc., to start studying Latin. So my sophomore year of college, I embarked on the study of Latin, and by the time I was a junior, I enrolled in a course called Ovid, taught by Professor Alan Cameron, who was teaching at Columbia at the time. So my introduction to Ovid was directly in Latin, in this sort of now falling apart book of students' Ovid, kind of with lots of notes and things like that. And he led us through some of the episodes of the poem, for sort of the intermediate reader. And I was passionate about what I was discovering. on the page in Latin. I was also, of course, very much in the process of still learning the language, learning how it worked. But there was clearly something in Ovid's poetry that spoke to me and to my very confused 19, 20-year-old self. It was speaking to me in terms of questions of identity. What is identity? Is there such a thing as a fixed identity? Spoke to me about questions of exile and my own family background, and questions of borders and hybridity. And I think that when I was encountering the poem for the first time, I really wasn't able to really even understand or to articulate these things to myself. But in this perpetual way that Ovid has, I can stand before you now and say that the Metamorphoses has been a source of ongoing inspiration and guidance to me personally and as an artist. So what does that mean? Well, after I studied with Alan Cameron and others, and then I graduated from college, and there was this brief moment I thought I wanted to be a classicist, and then I turned in another direction and I became a writer instead, a writer in the English language, and wrote about some of these questions that we can trace back to Ovid, questions of hybrid identity, uncertain identities, migrations, exile, and so forth. But then about, 2 decades into this project of writing in English, my life took another unexpected turn, and I began to write in Italian, as was just mentioned. At this point, I really circled back to Ovid, because people kept asking me, well, why is this happening? And why are you doing this? And what's behind it? And what's going on? And I began to write a column in Italian for a weekly magazine called Internazionale, which is based in Rome, where I was living. And I kept writing, week by week, sort of what was behind this? What I was trying to understand it for myself. Why would I, someone who really had no relationship to the Italian language, no family connections, no professional connections, no rational reason, right, to gravitate toward this language so in such a profound way. And at one point, as I was keeping this column, I realized, oh, Apollo and Daphne, I think that my reading of this episode, which has impacted me since the age of 20, is going to help me to understand for myself and perhaps to my readers what is going on, this search for freedom from something that I felt was constraining me, in this case, in that time, the English language. So then Ovid became a new source of revelation and clarification for what was going on inside of my own life creatively and personally. So I'm talking about around 15 years ago. Anyway, and I wrote some other pieces about, inspired by my new reading of Ovid. And by this time I'm in Italy, and so I'm rediscovering Ovid in Italian. And if I go back to the Latin, I'm reading Ovid in Latin, thanks to my new understanding of Italian commentaries, Professor Barchiesi's work, the huge scholarship. All of this is now giving me a new entry point into Ovid. All right, so that is a bit of background for you. So now we're going to fast forward to 2020, relatively recent past. I was teaching at Princeton University at the time, and Professor Yelena Baraz approached me to co-teach a course with her. And it was a course called Ancient Plots, Modern Twists. And we were going to sort of, team teach this course in which we would look at literature from antiquity, Western antiquity, and sort of pair it with more contemporary works. And in fact, one of the works we read was The Vegetarian. All right, I'm going to actually use my slide here. So we decided when we were cooking the class together to create 4 thematic blocks. And so the blocks we decided on were, one was abandonment. The second was monster. These are images from Yelena, she gave me, by the way, kindly. Plague was the third block, and metamorphosis itself. I'm just going to circle back to some of these here. We planned this course in the fall of 2019, so everyone knows what happened next. The pandemic came, and so we taught the course in the fall of 2020 entirely online, not realizing that the plague block was going to have a particular resonance for us all. Anyway, in the metamorphosis block, of course, we read Ovid. We read some of Ovid's Metamorphoses with the students. We read Kafka. We read Han Kang. And it was just an incredible course. And I think as we were teaching it, Yelena realized how passionate I was about Ovid. And so something rather incredible happened in the winter of 2021, which was that a young editor at Modern Library named Noah Shapiro, who actually was a classics major at Barnard, approached Yelena Baraz saying, I work at Modern Library. There is no Ovid's Metamorphoses in our series. Would you be willing to take this on and work with another person, ideally a writer, because our interest is in getting a collaboration between a trained classicist and a creative writer to produce a new translation. So that is the genesis, technically, of our translation. But I wanted to tell you this pre-story, because that's kind of what Ovid is too, right? There is no clear fixed beginning ever. There's always a pre-story to everything. And everything starts slipping both forward and backward very quickly as you start reading the poem. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you a little bit about our process. So what happened in the beginning? Yelena Baraz created this, what we called interlinear, but quickly became known as the basic version, okay? So Yelena knew that my study of Latin was 30 years old and quite rusty, but I was eager to, get it back bring it back to life. So she created this, this type of translation of literally line by line, and to show me sort of exactly what the Latin was doing, so that I would have no doubts about the syntax, and so forth. And as you can see, she often would use a slash to, when she was not sure whether she liked spirit or mind for animus, and so forth. So she generated the entire poem in this way. And she would give me, episode by episode, they were coming my way. And then I would look at this, I would look at my Tarrant, the Tarrant version of the poem, sort of looking at the Latin, looking at this, and trying to make sense of the poem in Latin, and then trying to render it into, a more readable English. And we knew that our task was to make produce a verse translation, that it was not to be prose, that it had to function, to thrive, rather, as poetry. Now, I am, generally a writer in prose. I have written some poetry, but I'm not trained as a poet. I've studied a lot of poetry in my life. So this is a huge challenge, to put it briefly. What is the next slide here? So, okay, here's just a slide on the word monstrum, from the verb monere. The idea of monstrosity, back to this monster block that that our course came out of. Why do I want to pause on this word? Well, because our translation is a kind of monstrous creature. It is literally double-headed, biceps. It's four-handed. And so when we think about the figure behind the translation, it is a kind of female monster, if you will. Yelena and I together, we are aware of this, and we kind of want to celebrate this fact, the fact that this is what we bring to the translation. Some other interesting details about this particular monster, if you will. Yelena's first language is Russian. She has, of course, excellent English and incomparable Latin. I myself have no proper mother tongue. My first language was Bengali. I was raised, for the most part, in the United States. I was educated in English, but I've never thought of English as my mother tongue. And then Italian came into the picture. So the two of us have these various languages that are also part of our sort of interesting monstrosity, if you will, in a good way, in a good, positive way. We want to celebrate this aspect because Ovid celebrates monstrosity, and also there are also very scary monsters that have to be defeated, of course, but others who are deeply human, centaurs who suffer, other quote unquote deformed beings who speak, who utter poetry, who woo women beautifully and tenderly. So, and then there's all sorts of characters in the poem who are turned into monsters in a very undeserving way. Medusa, perhaps one of the most well-known. And so here, this next slide is just the very first time we encounter the word in book one, and in part, she created monsters, and we were sort of struck by the fact that there's this female, she created monsters in this passage. Here is an example of the monstrous quality of the translation in progress. So you can see it's tiny, but this is a basic printout from many years back now. And you can see that the interlinear basic translation has fallen away. This is entirely in English. There's no more Latin anymore. Noah Shapiro was then giving us comments on the side. And I'm, at the top of the page, I'm writing in all of these words for the sea in Latin so that I can remember the difference and how to work from one to the other. And I'm annotating and doing all sorts of things. So that's what the translation looked like for a good while. Then what happened? All right, so this is the very beginning of the poem, the proem, the thing that comes before, right? Remember I was saying there's something always that comes before the beginning in Ovid. So this is the very beginning of the poem in Latin. I can't tell you how many laps I've swum in the swimming pool reciting these first 4 lines to myself to try to enter into their rhythm. And I've put into bold, I hope it's clear, some of these sticking points in this proem. And so you can see we go from soul to spirit, the verb stirs becomes soars, this really irritating bit in the parentheses, the whole question of the pronoun, the teasing out as opposed to unfurl for the verb deducere. And then, do we want origins? Do we want first? Do we want initial? You can see the endless possibilities making one quickly very crazy. And so, you know, morale, what am I trying to say here? It's that once you begin translating this poem, it becomes very unstable very quickly, and you are literally inside of an Ovidian reality in which something is constantly threatening to turn into something else. So the process of translating this poem really teaches you in every way, shape, and form what Ovid's entire vision was. So we become kind of living embodiments of and carriers of what is going on in this poem. What happens next? Oh, here's a little bit extra of a couple more versions. Intends, spurred. I was very excited when I got to spurred. That was just a year ago. I'd landed on spurred for this innova fert animus. It's not carried, but just from these machinations and meditations year after year of trying to imagine what it might be, realizing it will never be, you know, necessarily tied to the original sense of the original words, and understanding that this was also, we would, you know, sort of praying at the altar of Ovid, asking for his forgiveness, saying, you who understand the necessity sometimes of radical transformation, please bless us in these choices, because sometimes we too have to make rather notable changes. Why do I have this word here? Well, this goes back to the abandonment block. And the question of abandonment as a necessary part of our translation process. I think one of the most difficult things is that, you know, again, in this two-headed way, I mean, Yelena is so obviously from all of her training and knowledge and expertise connected to Ovid's text, to the Latin text, which she loves and knows and teaches, but to realize in this Janus-like way that it also had to face in the other direction, in the direction of English, in the direction of fluid, modern, fresh, readable English. And so this word, which I began to see everywhere in the poem, this question of having to leave things behind, leaving behind parts of yourself, leaving behind body parts, leaving behind your parents, leaving behind your homeland. This is an incredible thematic underpinning of the entire poem. This really helped me in understanding how our translation could progress and grow. All right. Here we have the question of plague. Why is plague, back to our course, why might plague be relevant to the process of translation? Well, one of the things Ovid talks about when he describes plague in book 7, at the plague in Aegina, he refers to plague again toward the end of the whole poem in book 15, is that bodies will become deformed. So I wanted to share this passage with you. You can see many bloated can't stand in water, these bodies that are sort of waterlogged, if you will. And here you can see Elena's literal translation as well to compare it to. But this idea of being bloated, misshapen, this has to happen to the translation as well. It has to become very ugly and heavy and misshapen and baggy before it can re-encounter the sort of beauty that is in Ovid's poem. So this is why I shared this. All right, so here's a little bit of a turning point moment that happens about a year ago. So about a year ago, we had the fourth version of the full draft. We had been through it many, many, many times. But I had a funny feeling that something was missing. Something was not working. And in fact, I had it read by my friend and former colleague at Princeton, the great poet Paul Muldoon. And so he read this version, the top there. And he said something very interesting to me. He said, he said two things. First of all, he said, when he looked at the poem, he said, why do you have all of these stirs/soars questions still in there? And I said, oh, well, we'll come back to that. There'll be like, we'll wake up one day and it'll be like the right answer will be there. But for now, we're just going ahead. And he said, no, you have to figure out how this poem is going to sound, because until you figure out how this poem is going to sound, you will not, the whole rest of the poem, all 12,000, however many lines, is not going to find its footing. And this was revolutionary news to me. And I shared this with Yelena. I said, we have to figure out something about the poem. We can't just leave it as a placeholder. He also said, Paul said, I'm not sure this is tasting like anything. I don't detect the voice of this translation. I think this is a problem. I said, yes, I agree. I think this is definitely a problem. So then I went away to Rome. I teach in the fall. I went away to Rome in January. I was wondering what we could possibly do to give the translation what was missing. And so I sat with it. And I thought about it. And I thought, of course, we're trying to write in verse, but there's no proper meter. There's no formal meter. What are we doing here? And I thought about Ovid's hexameter and the 6 feet of the hexameter, something our lines clearly do not have. But what I started to do in this third little block is I literally started playing with my tab function on the computer and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as a kind of nod graphically to Ovid's meter, which is such a huge component of his poem, which is one of the things that makes his poem sing and run and prance and move, right? And that was what I felt we didn't have in our translation at the moment. So I started playing with it. And as you can see, this exploration ended up in what we now have 2 versions of possibilities, whether we want this inspire what I've begun for coiptis or inspire this endeavor. And then do we want to use the word which you've also changed or you've changed it already. Still some things to work on there. But what we have arrived on now is literally a new form for the poem. We have moved away from the familiar form of the Metamorphoses, whether it's in Latin or in another translation. I don't know of any other translations that have played with the line in this way. But what I soon began to discover as I put more and more of the poem into this indented form is that it began to have meaning both as language and as form, literally. So if you look at this section from Echo and Narcissus, you see this kind of lovely symmetry that we see, which I think is an interesting comment on the idea of someone looking at his own image in the water. It also has a sense of, this particular stanza has a sense of perhaps an arrow or a wing, and many do. And I think that ties into the many avian translations in the poem, the theme and preoccupation with hunting and being hunted, pursuing, chasing. But one of the things that really happened when I started moving the poem literally, moving the lines rather, is that the poem gained speed. And I knew that speed was so crucial to Ovid and crucial to a translation that we would be satisfied with. So here are just a couple other examples. So you can see here we have the Daedalus, that citation from Joyce, now reworked in this form here. And in my computer, I have, after these many years of working in the everything flush left, and once it started moving, I started to distinguish it from the other versions. I started to call these files the onde draft. So onde is Italian for waves, because they also seem to me like waves. And so this was also very satisfying to me because of the liquidity that is so crucial to Ovid and to his poetics. All of the water transformations, all of the descriptions of water. So you saw in that previous translation that I was writing out all of the words that Ovid has to describe seas, waves, and so forth. So it's really changed. It's really gone through a literal change of form, and in addition to change of language. And I have now just finished revising book 15. So now we have an entire draft of this moving, undulating metamorphoses. Yelena is now still looking to make sure everything is, that nothing has slipped too far away from the sense of Ovid. As a kind of interesting bookend to this New York, my connection to New York and the Metamorphoses, I am now teaching Ovid's Metamorphoses at Barnard. So, okay, full circle there. And I'm teaching this translation in progress to my students and getting feedback from them and sort of trying to gauge how much of this is working for them, what are their questions, what still has to be done, what still has to be refined. And I am arguing that this poem, in addition to being my personal key to understanding pretty much everything, myself and the universe and everything in between, but I'm arguing that there are many elements in this poem that we can consider proto-feminist, and there are many elements in this poem that we can define as being experimental and even postmodernist. And I won't belabor that because that's a much longer conversation that maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. But this has also been a really beautiful experience, I must say personally, to be able to share with my students this still becoming, this translation that is still becoming. And I think, of course, the goal is that one day we will stop translating the poem and we will sign off on it and it will leave our hands and go to the publishers and they will put it into page proofs and, and then the plus side of that is that it will be a book and we can share it and it can reach more readers, but something will be lost. And what will be lost is that sense of the perpetual nature of translation and of translating Ovid in particular, because I think in another life or the road not taken, I really could live out the rest of my years continuing to contemplate this extraordinary work of literature, this poem, this uniquely powerful poem. So anyway, again, that too kind of creates this sort of interesting two-headed Janus-like set of possibilities, I suppose. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
time for the questions and answers now, but not before. I thank personally Jhumpa for these wonderful insights on the transformations of the Metamorphoses. And we have run a little bit slower than we thought, so probably Q&A more like 15 or 20 minutes at most rather than 30, but there will be another session tomorrow at the end of the afternoon, and therefore there will be also possibility of going back to questions that perhaps have arisen today.
Thank you so much, Jhumpa. I have a couple of quick questions, which many people probably will have. It's even too common to ask a famous writer about next projects, but it's almost necessary to ask, will there be any Ovid in your next work of narrative? And second, is there any Bengali Ovid for you? Is there any way that your previous,
Yeah, well, the new fictional project I've recently drafted, I have a draft of a new book, contains quite a bit of Ovid. And in fact, today I was talking about the book with another Alessandro, Alessandro Giammei, and he has just read this book, which has some Ovidian origins, if you will, because there's no clear point of origin for the book linguistically. It was a book I started writing in Italian, and it shifted into English, and then it became this sort of undulating text in that sense as well. But one of the refrains in the book is this, it's not attributed to Ovid. We see it in other works, of course, in Latin, but this term, this idea of pone metus, lay down your fear, set fear aside, what have you. And we talked about how this could be a subtitle for the novel. But there's a lot. But apart from that, there are numerous references to the reading of the Metamorphoses in this particular project.
And just as a follow-up, since you're also famous as a writer of short stories, is there a way in which the format of Metamorphoses, the short narratives, are particularly appealing to you?
I teach the poem as, among other things, I suggest to people, and I've drafted some introductory materials for this project that will someday become a book. And in that introduction, I propose that it is in some sense a short story collection, really big one, but a kind of compendium of short. That's what makes this poem unique compared to, say, the Aeneid or other epic poems where we have an identifiable human hero and a plot line and, rising action and, conflicts and, but there's a backbone, narrative backbone, which Ovid the Metamorphoses does not have. So I think that, and I think what's interesting and very true is that relatively few people really ever tackle this entire poem, right? And I certainly did not. With all of my love for it, I read it haltingly in Latin in Professor Cameron's class, but then when I would go back to it, when I was reading it in various times in my life for my studies or whatever, I would always read maybe like 3/4 or something. There was a lot of skipping around. But I think that that's something that Ovid, he invites that. It is possible. You don't have to start at the very beginning. You can skip sections. That said, in my class, one of the things we're doing, my students and we're literally reading from book 1 to book 15, and we are making, and there's this lovely, rich conversation that is coming from that, because we can trace the progression, we can trace the patterns, we can trace the linkages, we can see how book 1, merges right into book 2, and we can see how books, 10 and 11 are so connected because of Orpheus, and, so we can see all of these really interesting internal patterns and linkages that you don't get if you are kind of doing selections, But I think that Ovid is, again, in this postmodern way, like he invites different kinds of reading. And this is very postmodernist, right? That you can You can find your way. You can read it in your way, and you can still enjoy it and experience coherence and meaning in the poem, whether you're reading it from the first line to the last line, or in a more piecemeal way. As for the Bengali question, I don't know if this poem has been translated into Bengali, but it would be so lovely if it were translated by somebody. I would be very excited by that. Mm.
Thank you. Are there any questions we can follow up from the audience? Right.
Thank you for this beautiful panel. I have a question actually stemming from Alessandro Barchiesi's paper, but then I think it sort of applies very well, perhaps even better to Jhumpa Lahiri's presentation, which is, so you made a very beautiful reference to the fact that, of course, Warburg was working with images in the Atlas of Memory, but then, and something which is very important to that project is the fact that he would move things around. And because, one of the big problems with that project is that, it's not a sort of fixed thing, because he would take the images and move them around, and in this moving things around, he would come up with different thoughts. And then listening to Jhumpa's work on, the translation of Ovid, and you really talked about moving things, and in particular, this idea of moving lines, but also moving words, because really, as we could see through your various steps, the words move around, and they also change, of course, because they, transform into something else when you find the right pitch for each of them. And then I would like to hear perhaps from both of you about this notion of, to what extent this sort of idea of moving around is relevant to your thinking about Ovid.
Thank you very much. That's a very postmodern question. So this is one of the reasons why Ovid became popular in postmodernism, and in fact, recognizing Ovid from short stories is in a sense more natural than looking for a complete equivalent, an epic equivalent. And this book that was important for me, the book by Alex Shakar, and is in fact a collection of short stories which you could actually reshuffle because it's based on the cityscape of New York, where you don't have a fixed sequence. So this is probably also why Ovid is frequently congenial to imagination of like metropolitan settings. But you should also,
Thank you, Eugenio, for that question about, movement is so, I also call it the onde draft, but I also refer to this as kind of the errant line, because it's literally, moving. And we know, those of us who know the poem know that when people are wandering in the poem, this usually leads to something. It always leads to something, and often it's not a very positive scenario. But we see people also wandering across borders because they're curious. At the end of the book, in book 15, we see people who want to leave their homeland. They want to know what else is out there, right? This impulse to see what is beyond the border, this very human impulse that is tied to centuries and centuries of human civilization since then. So I think two things. I think one is the visual graphic movement of the line is, in some sense, it is what we can contribute, what Yelena and I can contribute as literally as a contribution among the many contributions of Ovid translation that has, staggering numbers of human beings have worked very hard to bring this poem into English over centuries. And we can see just a kind of a bumper crop just in recent years. So one thing that we can say our translation is doing is, okay, this is something new, and the word new is so important for Ovid. It's in the very first line of the poem. And is everywhere in the poem, and the sense of new in Latin can be both new and odd or strange. Well, this is a bit of a new Ovid on the page, also a kind of strange Ovid. We hope not estranging, but strange, right? We hope in an interesting way, and inviting the reader to ask, why are these lines moving in this way? And what is the movement of these lines contributing to our understanding of the poem? And I do think that, in addition to these various kinds of transformation that are kind of symbolized in the stanzas and the way they're moving, I think Ovid's poem it's a poem to movement, right? It's a poem to literally to things moving through different states of being, right? And this too we can read as movement. And I wish I had some slides of the illustrations that were put into Bone into Stone by the artist Jamie Nares, and they're all about this sort of turbulent movement. And Ovid is so interested too in like how things are all spinning and moving, and wind movement, and stars, and celestial. So it's not just that we're moving around, or the gods are flying around, or people are crossing borders. It's just that everything is in this ongoing. There is so little that is static. That then, of course, we can talk about the stone transformations and realize that there is this beautiful tension in the poem too, between the ongoing movement and the underpinning of the movement, and these moments where things are brought to a standstill, or people are brought to a standstill.
Alessandro, do you want to close day one?
Well, just to say, as Jhumpa just mentioned, I was very struck when I read the book by the contrast, which is a very meaningful contrast between this discussion about stones and these images of movement, of vortex, of waves, indeed, as you put it, that you must have chosen, or you must have discussed with the artist to somehow.
They were beautifully we were paired by the editor.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, then the editor or the artist thought that this was a jarring, at the same time very meaningful connection between the supposed fixity of stone and these images of vortex and of water most of the time. This goes to really goes back to a fundamental question and a fundamental challenge that the Metamorphoses pose, and on which you have discussed and Sandra has written about, which is these a poem about a final transformation, a once and for all transformation. The laurel tree didn't exist, but then after Daphne, it did exist, and that's it. Now we have it. Or and Daphne is no more, that the laurel tree exists. Or is this a world where these processes can actually be reversed? Can they happen again? As actually Daphne, for instance, lost all sensitivity, or when does she lose this sensitivity? Is there a reverse process possible? Is Niobe, who is morphed into a rock but is still weeping, is Niobe still there? Can she come back from that state? Is this kind of process of metamorphosis irreversible or not? And you just showed that the process of rewriting the metamorphosis in itself sort of is an undulatory and reversible and wavy movement, which I thought was extremely fascinating to listen. I think I'm tasked now with saying that this is the end, except it's just the end for today, is, the beginning of the end is reception time, but there will be time tomorrow to pursue some of these topics. Thanks you very much.
Thank you.